The hospital auditorium fell into an expectant silence as Catherine Morrison made her way to the old upright piano in the corner. At 71 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun, and hands that had spent 5 decades caring for the sick and dying, she looked like exactly what everyone thought she was: a retired nurse who'd volunteered to play something pleasant at the annual St. Mary's Hospital charity fundraiser. The audience of 200 hospital staff, of former patients, local donors, watched with polite but minimal interest. Some were already checking their phones. Others whispered to their neighbors about when the real entertainment would begin. The hospital administrator introducing her had simply said, "Catherine Morrison, who retired last year after 50 years of dedicated service to our nursing staff, has graciously agreed to play for us this evening." No one knew who she really was. No one suspected what was about to happen. And no one could have imagined that in less than an hour, the video of this moment would begin its journey toward 50 million views, or that it would uncover a mystery that had haunted American classical music for half a century. Catherine sat down on the worn piano bench, her hands trembling slightly as they hovered over the keys. In the front row, her granddaughter Emma watched with tears already forming in her eyes, knowing what no one else in the room knew, knowing what it had taken to get her grandmother to this moment, knowing the 50 years of silence that were about to be broken. What happened next would leave everyone speechless. But to understand why, you need to know the story behind the silence. You need to know about a promise made in blood and snow on a December night in 1966. You need to know about a girl named Annie, a tragedy that changed everything, and 5 decades of guilt that had buried one of the most extraordinary musical talents America had ever produced. This is that story. Catherine Morrison was not supposed to be here. Not at this piano, not at this moment, not breaking a vow she'd kept for longer than most people in this room had been alive. For 50 years, she'd been a fixture at St. Mary's Hospital in Boston. She'd started as a young nurse in 1967, just 21 years old, with shadows in her eyes that her colleagues noticed, but never asked about. She'd worked the pediatric ward, the intensive care unit, the emergency room. She'd held the hands of dying patients and sung soft lullabies to frightened children. She'd been there for births and deaths, for miracles and heartbreaks, for every kind of human suffering and joy that passed through those hospital doors. Everyone knew Catherine as the kind of nurse who stayed late, who remembered every patient's name, who had a particular gift for comforting people in their darkest moments. She'd married David Morrison, a surgeon at the hospital, in 1971. They'd had one daughter, Rachel, who grew up to become a teacher. David had passed away 5 years ago from a sudden heart attack, and Catherine had grieved him quietly and completely, the way she seemed to do everything with a deep intensity that she kept carefully hidden beneath a calm, gentle exterior. When she'd retired at 70, there had been a small party. People had shared stories about her compassion, her dedication, her seemingly infinite capacity for caring. No one had mentioned music. No one had mentioned piano. Because no one knew. In 50 years, Catherine had never once mentioned that she'd ever played an instrument. She'd never attended the hospital's annual holiday concerts. She'd never joined the staff choir. She'd never even hummed while she worked. Her granddaughter Emma, at 28, had only discovered the truth 3 months ago. Emma was a freelance journalist working on a piece about the history of classical music in Boston. While researching teenage prodigies of the 1960s, she'd stumbled across a newspaper archive from 1965. The headline read, "Catherine Aldridge, 15 stuns Carnegie Hall audience, the next great American pianist." The photograph with the article showed a young girl at a grand piano, her fingers spread across the keys, her face radiant with concentration and joy. Emma had stared at that photograph for a full minute before the recognition hit her like a physical blow. The bone structure, the shape of the eyes, the set of the jaw, it was unmistakably her grandmother. Catherine Aldridge, who had become Catherine Morrison when she married. The greatest musical prodigy of her generation, who had simply vanished. Emma had done what any journalist would do. She'd dug deeper. She'd found more articles, rave reviews, recordings of performances. Catherine Aldridge at 12 playing Mozart at Symphony Hall. Catherine at 14 performing Rachmaninoff at a White House reception. Catherine at 15 giving what critics called the performance of the decade at Carnegie Hall, with a Juilliard scholarship waiting and a future that seemed limitless. And then, in late 1966, nothing. Catherine Aldridge had disappeared from the classical music world as completely as if she'd never existed. No explanation, no farewell performance, no interviews, just silence. When Emma had confronted her grandmother, Catherine had initially refused to talk about it. She'd actually stood up and started to leave her own living room. But Emma had persisted gently but firmly, and finally Catherine had sat back down, closed her eyes, and after a long, painful silence had begun to tell the story she'd kept locked inside for 50 years. The story of what happened on a snowy night in December 1966. The story of her sister Annie. The story of a promise she'd made and the guilt that had defined her entire adult life. To understand what Catherine gave up, you have to understand what she had. You have to understand what it meant to be Catherine Aldridge in 1965. She'd started playing piano when she was 4 years old. Her father, William Aldridge, was a music teacher at a public school in Providence, Rhode Island. He'd noticed something extraordinary in his daughter from the very first time she touched the keys. It wasn't just that she could play lots of children could learn to play. It was the way she understood music, the way she seemed to hear things that others couldn't, the way her small fingers found harmonies and variations that he'd never taught her. By the time she was 6, Catherine was performing at local recitals. By 8, she'd won her first state competition. By 10, she had an agent and was performing professionally. Her father had quit his teaching job to manage her career and continue her musical education. Her mother, Margaret, had worked 2 jobs to support the family while Catherine's career developed. And her little sister Annie, 3 years younger, had been Catherine's biggest fan and constant companion. Annie had worshipped her older sister. She'd attended every performance, sitting in the front row with their mother watching with shining eyes as Catherine made magic at the piano. Annie wanted to be just like her sister. She'd started piano lessons herself at 5, and while she didn't have Catherine's extraordinary gift, she had genuine talent and a deep love for music. Catherine had often helped teach Annie, and those moments the 2 sisters at the piano together. Catherine's hands guiding Annie's through a difficult passage were among Catherine's happiest memories. The family wasn't wealthy. William Aldridge's teaching salary had been modest, and even with Catherine's performance fees, money was always tight. They lived in a small house, drove an old car, and made sacrifices so that Catherine could have the best instruction and the opportunities she needed. But there was love in that house, and music, and a sense that they were all working together towards something extraordinary. By 1965, when Catherine was 15, that something extraordinary was happening. The Carnegie Hall performance in November of that year was supposed to be her breakthrough moment, and it was. She'd performed Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and the reviews had been unanimous in their awe. The New York Times critic had written, "Not since the young Van Cliburn has America produced a talent of this magnitude. Catherine Aldridge doesn't just play the piano, she transforms it into an extension of her soul." The Juilliard scholarship had been offered immediately. There was talk of recording contracts, international tours, a future that glittered with possibility. At 15, Catherine was standing at the threshold of everything she'd worked for, everything her family had sacrificed for. She was going to be one of the greats. Everyone said so. It was only a matter of time. Annie at 12 had been so proud she could barely speak. Catherine remembered the night after Carnegie Hall, back in their hotel room, when Annie had thrown her arms around her and whispered, "You were so beautiful up there. You were like magic. I want to be just like you someday." Catherine had hugged her sister tight and said, "You'll be even better. I'll teach you everything I know." It was a promise she would never get to keep. December 19th, 1966. That was the night everything changed. That was the night the music died. Catherine had just performed at Symphony Hall in Boston. Another triumph. The audience had given her 3 standing ovations. The conductor had kissed her hand. The critics once again had run out of superlatives. At 16 now, Catherine was being hailed as mature beyond her years, a performer of rare emotional depth combined with technical brilliance. People were already comparing her to the greatest pianists of the 20th century. After the performance, there had been a reception. Donors, critics, other musicians, all wanting to talk to the prodigy. Catherine had been gracious but tired. All she'd wanted was to go home to Providence to see her family, to sleep in her own bed. Her father was going to stay in Boston overnight to handle some business with her agent. But Catherine was eager to get home. She'd just gotten her driver's license a few months earlier, and she'd volunteered to drive herself and Annie back to Providence that night. Their mother had been hesitant. It was late, nearly 10 o'clock. The forecast called for snow, but Catherine had insisted she'd be fine. She was a careful driver. The roads between Boston and Providence were familiar. It was only an hour's drive. And Annie had wanted to go. She had school the next morning, and she'd begged to ride with her big sister, just the 2 of them, so they could talk about the performance. Margaret had finally agreed. She'd kissed both her daughters goodbye, made them promise to drive carefully to call as soon as they got home. Catherine remembered her mother standing in the doorway of the concert hall, waving, her face illuminated by the streetlights, worry and pride mixed in her expression. It was the last time their mother would see Annie alive. The first 30 minutes of the drive had been perfect. Annie had been bubbling over with excitement about the performance, asking Catherine about different passages, about what she'd been feeling during the standing ovation, about what it was like to be on stage with the full orchestra behind her. Catherine had been happy, relaxed, basking in the afterglow of another successful performance. They'd talked about the future. Annie had said she wanted to go to Juilliard too someday. She wanted to perform duets with her sister. They could travel the world together, she'd said. 2 sisters making music together. Wouldn't that be amazing? Catherine had laughed and said yes, that would be amazing. She'd teach Annie everything. They'd be a team. The snow had started about 40 minutes into the drive, just as they crossed into Rhode Island. Light at first, then heavier. Catherine had slowed down, concentrating on the road. The windshield wipers had struggled to keep up with the increasingly heavy snowfall. Traffic had thinned to almost nothing. The highway had begun to look treacherous, covered in a layer of white that made it hard to see the lane markings. Annie had stopped talking, sensing her sister's concentration. She'd reached over and turned the radio down. Catherine remembered feeling grateful for that small gesture of understanding. Annie had always been thoughtful that way. It happened on a curve about 10 miles from home. Catherine never saw the patch of black ice. One moment the car was moving forward under control. The next moment it was spinning, sliding sideways, and Catherine was fighting the wheel, trying to remember everything she'd learned about how to handle a skid. Don't brake hard. Steer into it. But nothing worked. The car kept sliding, kept spinning, and then it was off the road, crashing through a guardrail that was too old and weak to stop them, and they were falling, tumbling down an embankment, and Annie was screaming, and Catherine was screaming, and there was the terrible sound of metal crunching and glass shattering, and then impact, devastating impact, and darkness. Catherine woke up in the hospital 2 days later. Her right hand was heavily bandaged. She had a concussion, 3 broken ribs, lacerations across her face and arms. She was alive. She would recover. Annie had died on impact. Massive head trauma. The doctor said she hadn't suffered, that it had been instantaneous, as if that made it better. She was 12 years old. She'd been sitting in the passenger seat, trusting her big sister to get her home safely. The last thing Annie had said, according to the accident report pieced together from Catherine's confused memories in the hospital, was, "I love you, Kate." And then, as the car went over the edge, Catherine remembered Annie reaching out and grabbing her hand, holding it tight. And in that final moment before impact, Annie had screamed, keep playing for both of us." Those were her little sister's last words. Keep playing for both of us. The Catherine Aldridge who woke up in that hospital bed was not the same girl who had taken the stage at Symphony Hall 2 days earlier. That girl was gone, buried under an avalanche of guilt and grief so massive it crushed everything else out of existence. The physical injuries healed more or less. The hand was the most serious concern from a musical standpoint. There was nerve damage in her right hand, damage to the tendons. The doctors had done surgery, had done everything they could, but they'd been honest with her. She would regain function, they'd said. She would be able to use the hand normally for daily activities. But the kind of precise, powerful, subtle control required for virtuoso-level piano playing that might never fully return. Might. That word had haunted her, because the truth was she probably could have recovered enough to play professionally. With therapy, with time, with dedication, she could have adapted, could have rebuilt her technique. Other pianists had overcome worse injuries. The hand was damaged, yes, but it wasn't destroyed. But Catherine hadn't cared about any of that, because the physical damage to her hand was nothing compared to the damage to her soul. She'd killed her sister. That was the thought that consumed her every waking moment. She'd been driving. She'd been the one who'd insisted they leave that night. She'd been the one who'd lost control of the car. Annie was dead because of her. That beautiful, bright, loving 12-year-old girl was gone, and it was Catherine's fault. Her parents tried to tell her it wasn't. They came to the hospital, their faces gray with grief, and they held her and told her it was an accident, that no one was to blame, that the ice had been invisible, that anyone could have crashed. They told her they didn't blame her, that they loved her, that they needed her. But Catherine saw the truth in their eyes behind the words of comfort. She saw the way her mother couldn't quite meet her gaze for more than a few seconds. She saw the way her father's hands shook when he hugged her. Annie had been their baby, and now she was gone. And no matter what they said, Catherine was the reason why. The funeral was a nightmare that Catherine barely remembered. She'd stood at the graveside in a black dress, staring at the small coffin, unable to cry, unable to feel anything except the vast, crushing weight of what she'd done. People had spoken, the minister, family members, friends. Someone had mentioned that Annie had wanted to be a pianist like her sister. Catherine had nearly collapsed at those words. After the funeral, Catherine had retreated into silence. She'd stayed in her room for weeks, barely eating, barely sleeping. When her father brought up the Juilliard scholarship, suggested gently that maybe music could help her heal, Catherine had looked at him with dead eyes and said, "I'm never playing again." He'd tried to argue. Her mother had tried to convince her. They'd brought in therapists, counselors, doctors. Everyone had told her that giving up her gift wouldn't bring Annie back, that Annie would have wanted her to continue, that she had to think about her future. But Catherine was unmovable. She'd made a decision, and it was absolute. Annie had died on the way home from Catherine's performance. Annie had died because of Catherine's music career, because of the late-night drive, because of everything that went with being Catherine Aldridge piano prodigy. If Catherine had never played piano, none of it would have happened. They would have been home that night. Annie would still be alive. In Catherine's mind, the math was simple. Her music had killed her sister. Therefore, she would kill her music. She'd withdrawn from Juilliard. She'd cancelled all her performances. She'd refused to touch a piano. And when people asked her what she was going to do instead, she'd given them an answer that had surprised everyone. She was going to become a nurse. If she couldn't save Annie, she would save others. If her hands couldn't create beauty at a piano, they would create comfort in a hospital. If she'd taken a life through her selfishness and ambition, she would spend the rest of her life giving back, caring for others, doing penance for the unforgivable thing she'd done. Her parents had been heartbroken. They'd tried to talk her out of it, but Catherine wouldn't listen. She'd enrolled in nursing school in Boston, gotten her degree, and started working at St. Mary's Hospital in 1967. She was 21 years old. She never spoke about her past. She never mentioned that she'd once been famous. She never told anyone she'd ever played piano. She made a promise at Annie's grave before she moved to Boston. She'd stood there alone one morning, her hand on the cold headstone, and she'd whispered, "I will never play again. I will never touch a piano again. That part of my life is dead just like you. I'm so sorry, Annie. I'm so sorry." It was a promise she kept for 50 years. 50 years is a long time to live with silence where music used to be. 50 years is a long time to carry guilt. But Catherine did it. She buried Catherine Aldridge the prodigy and became Catherine Morrison the nurse, and she never looked back. St. Mary's Hospital became her entire world. She worked the pediatric intensive care unit, first drawn to sick children, with a fierce protective instinct that everyone noticed, but no one quite understood. She was the nurse who stayed late, who held crying toddlers through the night, who sang soft lullabies to frightened children facing surgery. She had a gift for comfort, everyone said. A way of making people feel safe. She never told anyone that every child she saved was Annie in her mind. That every time she held a terrified 7-year-old's hand, or soothed a crying infant, or sat beside the bed of a teenager fighting for life, she was trying to atone. Trying to balance the scales. Trying to earn the right to exist in a world where Annie didn't. In 1971, she met David Morrison. He was a surgical resident, quiet and kind, with gentle hands, and a serious demeanor that hid a dry sense of humor. They'd been working a difficult case together, a child who'd been in a car accident, actually, which was perhaps too on the nose for fate, but was what it was. The child had survived barely thanks in part to Catherine's quick thinking and David's skill in the operating room. Afterward, David had found Catherine in the break room, staring into a cup of coffee. He'd sat down across from her and said, "You were incredible in there." She'd shrugged, "Just doing my job." "No," he'd said. "It was more than that. You were talking to her the whole time, keeping her calm, keeping her fighting. I think you saved her life as much as I did." They'd started talking. It had turned out they had things in common, both dedicated to their work. Both somewhat solitary, both carrying secrets they didn't talk about. David had his own ghosts, it turned out. A brother who'd died young, a father who'd been abusive. Pain recognized pain. They'd started dating. 6 months later, David had proposed. Catherine had said yes, not because she was madly, passionately in love. That part of her she felt had died with Annie, but because David was good and kind, and he made her feel safe, and maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what she deserved. The wedding had been small. Catherine had invited no one from her old life. Her parents had come older now, quieter still, grieving their lost daughter in their own private ways. They never spoke about Annie at the wedding. They never mentioned Catherine's former career. It was as if Catherine Aldridge had never existed, and they were all complicit in maintaining that fiction. Catherine and David had one child, a daughter they named Rachel. Catherine had been terrified during the pregnancy, convinced something would go wrong, that this was more than she deserved. But Rachel had been born healthy and perfect, and Catherine had loved her with a fierce intensity that surprised even herself. She'd been a devoted mother, perhaps overprotective, never letting Rachel out of her sight for longer than necessary. David had gently teased her about it, but he'd understood. Rachel grew up never knowing her mother had been anyone other than a nurse. She never knew about Carnegie Hall, or the rave reviews, or the Juilliard scholarship. When Rachel took piano lessons as a child, just casual lessons, nothing serious. Catherine had supported it, but hadn't attended the recitals. She'd claimed work obligations, but the truth was she couldn't bear to watch. Couldn't bear to hear piano music without feeling the crushing weight of everything she'd given up and why. David had known there was something in Catherine's past, some deep wound she didn't talk about. He'd asked once, early in their marriage, and she'd told him about the accident, about Annie's death. She'd told him she'd been driving, that her sister had died, that it was her fault. She hadn't told him about the piano, hadn't told him who she'd been. And he'd respected her silence, had held her when she cried on the anniversary of Annie's death every December, had loved her as completely as she'd let herself be loved. David had died suddenly 5 years ago, a heart attack at 68, while working a long shift at the hospital. Catherine had been at home when she got the call. She'd arrived at the emergency room to find her colleagues working on her husband, and she'd known from their faces that it was hopeless. He'd been gone before he hit the ground. The grief had nearly destroyed her. David had been her anchor, her safe place, the one person who'd known at least part of her pain. Without him, the silence became even heavier. She'd thrown herself into work even harder. Stayed later, took extra shifts because going home to the empty house was unbearable. She'd retired at 70, not because she wanted to, but because the hospital had mandatory retirement age policies. Her last day had been full of tears from her colleagues' speeches about her dedication, a plaque honoring her 50 years of service. She'd smiled and thanked everyone, and gone home to a house that felt like a tomb. For a year after retirement, Catherine had drifted. She volunteered at the hospital occasionally. She visited Rachel and her family. She went to the grocery store, the library, the park. She existed. But there was a hollowness to it all, a sense that she was just waiting for permission to stop. She visited Annie's grave every month, sometimes more. The headstone read, Annie Aldridge, beloved daughter and sister, 1954 to 1966. Catherine would sit on the grass beside it and talk to her sister, tell her about Rachel and Rachel's daughter Emma, tell her about the patients she'd saved, ask for forgiveness that she knew would never come because the dead don't forgive, and neither did she forgive herself. In all those 50 years, Catherine never once played piano, never attended a concert, never listened to classical music on the radio, never hummed a tune. She'd excised music from her life as completely as a surgeon removes a tumor, cutting away everything that reminded her of who she'd been and what she'd lost. The silence was complete. The silence was her punishment. The silence was her life, until Emma found out. Emma Morrison had always been curious about her grandmother. There was something about Grandma Kate that didn't quite add up. A sadness that went deeper than widowhood. A carefulness in the way she moved through the world, as if she was afraid of taking up too much space. An intelligence in her eyes that seemed like it should have had more outlets than it did. Emma was a journalist freelance, mostly writing for music magazines and arts publications. At 28, she was still establishing herself, still taking whatever assignments came her way. In the summer of 2017, she'd gotten a commission to write a piece about teenage musical prodigies in America during the 20th century. It was a retrospective piece, looking at what had happened to all those young talents, which ones had flourished and which had burned out. She'd been researching in the Boston Public Library's digital newspaper archives when she'd found the article November 20th, 1965. The Boston Globe. A full-page spread about Catherine Aldridge's performance at Carnegie Hall the previous week. The photograph had stopped Emma cold. She'd been scrolling through microfiche, half paying attention, when that image appeared on the screen and her brain simply stuttered to a halt. It was her grandmother. 52 years younger, but unmistakably her grandmother. Same bone structure, same intense eyes, same small scar on her left eyebrow that Grandma Kate had always said came from falling off a bicycle as a child. But this girl wasn't on a bicycle. She was at a grand piano, her hands spread across the keys in a moment of musical ecstasy, and the caption read, "Catherine Aldridge, 15 performs Rachmaninoff at Carnegie Hall." Emma had read the article 3 times, her heart pounding. The reviews were extraordinary. A once-in-a-generation talent. The future of American classical music. Breathtaking maturity and technical brilliance. She'd immediately searched for more. Found dozens of articles spanning several years. Catherine Aldridge at 12, winning competitions. At 13, performing with major orchestras. At 14, playing at the White House. And at 15, that triumphant Carnegie Hall performance. And then in late 1966, nothing. The articles stopped. Catherine Aldridge vanished from the classical music world. Emma had sat in that library for hours, piecing it together. She'd found the obituary for Annie Aldridge, December 1966. Died in automobile accident. She'd found a brief news article about the crash. She'd found Catherine Aldridge's name mentioned as the driver hospitalized with injuries. After that, nothing. No follow-up articles. No return to performing. Catherine Aldridge simply disappeared. Emma had gone home that night with her mind spinning. She'd pulled out old family photo albums looking at pictures of her grandmother with new eyes. She'd found one photo from her grandparents' wedding in 1971. Grandma Kate looking serious and thin. Her right hand positioned slightly awkwardly in a way Emma had never noticed before. No family on Catherine's side except 2 older people who must have been her parents, both looking haunted. Emma had spent a week gathering courage before confronting her grandmother. She'd shown up at Catherine's house one Saturday morning with a folder full of printed articles and photographs. Catherine had answered the door with a smile that had faded when she'd seen Emma's face. Grandma Emma had said, "We need to talk." They'd sat in the living room, and Emma had spread the articles out on the coffee table. Catherine had looked at them, and all the color had drained from her face. "How did you find these?" she'd whispered. "I'm a journalist, Grandma. I was researching teenage prodigies. I found you by accident. But once I found one article, I found all the rest." Emma had leaned forward. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone? Mom doesn't even know, does she?" "No." Catherine's voice was barely audible. "No one knows. No one was supposed to know. But why, Grandma? You were amazing. These reviews, you were going to be one of the greatest pianists in the world." What happened? Catherine had stood up, then actually stood up, and started walking toward the door, as if she could physically escape the conversation. But Emma had followed her. "Please," Emma had said. "Please talk to me. I need to understand." And maybe it was the 50 years of silence finally becoming too heavy to bear. Maybe it was the fact that Emma reminded Catherine of herself at that age. Passionate, determined, alive in a way Catherine no longer felt. Maybe it was simply time. But Catherine had stopped walking, had stood in her hallway with her back to Emma, and had started talking. She'd told Emma everything. About Annie, about the accident, about the promise she'd made, about the guilt that had consumed her entire adult life, about how music had died for her the night Annie died. Emma had listened, tears streaming down her face. When Catherine finished, they'd sat together on the couch, and Emma had hugged her grandmother while they both cried. "Oh, Grandma," Emma had finally said. "You've been carrying this alone all this time. I deserve to carry it," Catherine had said. "Annie died because of me, because of my music, my career, my selfishness. It was an accident, Grandma, a terrible, tragic accident. But it wasn't your fault. I was driving, on black ice in a snowstorm. No one could have controlled that car. It could have happened to anyone." But Catherine had shaken her head. In 50 years, no one had been able to convince her. And Emma couldn't either. Over the next few weeks, Emma had visited frequently. She'd brought more articles, old recordings she'd found. She'd discovered that some of Catherine's performances had been recorded, preserved in music archives. She'd downloaded one, the Carnegie Hall performance from 1965, and had brought it to her grandmother's house on her laptop. "Please," Emma had said, "just watch it with me. Just see yourself as you were." Catherine had resisted at first, but Emma had been gently relentless. Finally, Catherine had agreed to watch just a few minutes. The video was grainy black and white, but the audio was clear. 15-year-old Catherine Aldridge walked onto the Carnegie Hall stage, small and serious in a black dress. She'd sat at the grand piano, adjusted the bench, and then her hands had touched the keys, and the music had begun. Catherine, watching herself 52 years later, had started crying within the first 30 seconds. Not quiet tears, huge wrenching sobs that seemed to tear themselves from somewhere deep in her chest. Emma had held her grandmother while she watched, and the two of them had cried together as the young Catherine on the screen played with a beauty and passion that transcended the decades between then and now. When the performance ended, a 17-minute piece that they'd watched in its entirety without speaking, Catherine had looked at Emma with red, swollen eyes. "I forgot," she'd whispered. "I forgot what it felt like. I forgot that I loved it so much." "You can still play," Emma had said carefully. "Your hands still work. You could play again." "No." Catherine had shaken her head. "I made a promise." "To who?" "To Annie." "Grandma." What did Annie say right before Emma had hesitated? "Mom told me you were with her when it happened." What were her last words? Catherine had closed her eyes. She said, "Keep playing. Keep playing for both of us." There was a long silence. Grandma Emma had finally said very gently, "Does that sound like someone who wanted you to stop?" Catherine had opened her eyes and stared at Emma as if seeing her for the first time. What Annie's last words were, "Keep playing," not "stop playing," not "give it up." Keep playing. For both of us. Maybe you've been misunderstanding what she wanted all along. Catherine had sat with that thought for a long moment. Then she'd shaken her head again. No, she was 12. She didn't understand what she was saying. She was terrified. Or maybe she understood perfectly. Maybe she knew she was dying and she wanted to make sure you didn't give up your gift. Maybe that's why she said it. But Catherine hadn't been ready to accept that. Not yet. She'd thanked Emma for coming, had asked her to take the laptop away, had retreated back into her silence. Emma had tried several more times over the next few weeks, But Catherine wouldn't budge. She'd apologize to Emma, would say she appreciated the effort. But no, she couldn't play again. She wouldn't. And then Emma had done something her grandmother never forgave her for, at least not right away. Emma had registered Catherine for the St. Mary's Hospital annual charity fundraiser talent show without asking permission. Catherine had received the email from the hospital fundraising committee on a Tuesday morning in late October. "Dear Catherine," it read, "we're so pleased that you volunteered to perform at our annual charity event. The show is scheduled for November 20th. Please let us know what piece you'll be playing so we can list it in the program." Catherine had called Emma immediately, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and panic. "What did you do?" Emma had been unapologetic. "I signed you up to play. The event is in 3 weeks, the hospital where you worked for 50 years. It's perfect. I didn't agree to this. I know. But Grandma, you need to do this. For yourself, for Annie. Maybe even for all those patients you've spent your life caring for. They deserve to see this part of you. You had no right. You're right. I didn't. But I did it anyway because someone needs to push you, and I love you enough to be that person." Catherine had hung up. She'd immediately called the hospital to withdraw, but the committee chair had been so excited and grateful that Catherine was participating that she hadn't been able to get the words out. The woman had gone on and on about how much it meant that Catherine was contributing, how they'd already sold 50 more tickets just from mentioning that some special performances were planned. Catherine had hung up again and sat in her silent house, feeling trapped. She didn't speak to Emma for a week, but Emma kept calling, kept leaving messages. She'd send text messages with simple things: "I love you. I believe in you." Annie would be proud. On the 8th day, Catherine had finally answered the phone. "I can't do this," she'd said without preamble. "I physically cannot do this. I haven't played in 50 years. My hand is damaged. I wouldn't even know how to begin." "Start small," Emma had said. "Just try. Just see if you can still do it. And if I can't, then we'll cancel. I'll call the hospital and explain there was a mistake, but try first. Please." Catherine had thought about it for 3 days. During those 3 days, she'd found herself thinking about music for the first time in decades, thinking about how it had felt to play, how the keys had felt under her fingers, how music had once been the language she'd used to express everything she couldn't say with words. She'd thought about Annie, about those last words. Keep playing for both of us. What if Emma was right? What if she'd been wrong all along about what Annie had wanted? On the 4th day, Catherine had gone to Annie's grave. It was late October, cold and gray leaves blowing across the cemetery. She'd sat on the grass beside the headstone, not caring that the ground was damp and cold. Annie, she'd said out loud, her voice carrying across the empty cemetery. "I don't know if you can hear me. I don't know if there's anything after death or if you're just gone. But if you can hear me, I need a sign. I need to know if I've been doing the right thing all these years. I've been trying to honor you by not playing, by giving it up because you couldn't have it. But Emma thinks maybe you wanted something different." The wind had blown harder, scattering more leaves. "I miss you so much," Catherine had whispered. "Every single day. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." She'd sat there for a long time, crying quietly. And then something had happened that Catherine couldn't quite explain even later. A memory had surfaced clear and sharp, as if it had been waiting 50 years to be remembered. It was from a few weeks before the accident. Catherine had been practicing in their living room, and Annie had been doing homework at the kitchen table. Catherine had been working on a particularly difficult passage, getting frustrated because she couldn't get it right. She'd stopped playing and put her head down on the keys in frustration. Annie had come into the living room. "What's wrong? I can't get this right. I'm going to make a mistake at the performance." Annie had hugged her from behind, her 12-year-old arms wrapped around her sister's shoulders. "You won't mess up. But even if you do, it doesn't matter. You'll keep playing. That's what you do. You keep playing no matter what." Catherine, sitting in the cemetery 50 years later, had started sobbing harder as that memory crystallized. Annie's words, "You keep playing no matter what." And then her last words, "Keep playing for both of us." Maybe Emma was right. Maybe Catherine had been wrong all along. Maybe Annie hadn't wanted her to stop. Maybe Annie's last wish had been exactly the opposite for Catherine to keep going, to keep playing to live enough for both of them. The thought was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Catherine had stood up, wiping her face. "Okay, Annie," she'd whispered. "Okay, I'll try." She'd gone home and called Emma. "I'll do it," she'd said. "I'll try to play, but I need your help." That night, Catherine had gone to the hospital. She still had her ID badge from her retirement. They'd let her keep it so she could visit. She'd used it to get in through the staff entrance at 11 p.m. when the building was quiet except for the night shift. The hospital had a small chapel on the second floor, and in the chapel in the corner was an old upright piano. It had been there as long as Catherine had worked at the hospital. She'd seen it thousands of times. She'd walked past it for 50 years and never once touched it. Now she stood in front of it, her hands shaking. The chapel was dark except for a small light above the piano. The building was silent around her. It was just Catherine and the piano, and 50 years of silence between them. She'd sat down on the bench. The wood was old and worn. The keys were yellowed with age. It was not Carnegie Hall. It was not a grand piano. It was just an instrument that had probably been played badly by hundreds of people over the decades. But it was a piano, and her hands knew what to do. Except they didn't at first. When she lifted her hands to the keys, they were shaking so badly she couldn't control them. When she tried to touch the keys, her right hand cramped immediately, the old injury flaring to life after decades of disuse for this specific purpose. She'd pulled her hands back, fighting tears. "I can't," she'd whispered. "I can't do this." She'd sat there for 10 minutes, hands in her lap, staring at the keys. She'd almost stood up and left. Almost given up right then. But then she'd thought about Emma's face, about Annie's last words, about 50 years of silence. She'd lifted her hands again. This time she'd pressed down slowly on a single key. Middle C. The note rang out in the quiet chapel, pure and simple, and achingly familiar. Catherine had played that single note again, and again. And then she'd added another note, and another. Slowly, painfully slowly, she'd begun to play a simple scale. C major. Just 5 fingers. The first thing her father had taught her when she was 4 years old. The fingers remembered. It was rough. It was halting. Her right hand hurt. She made mistakes, but the fingers remembered. She'd played that scale 10 times. Then she'd tried a simple melody. Mary Had a Little Lamb, something a beginner would play. It sounded childish and clumsy, but she got through it. She'd stayed in that chapel for 2 hours that first night playing simple things, retraining her hands, fighting through the pain and the emotion. When she finally left, her right hand was aching badly, but something in her chest felt lighter than it had in 50 years. She'd come back the next night, and the next. Every night for 2 weeks, Catherine had snuck into the hospital chapel at 11 p.m. and played the old upright piano for 2 or 3 hours. Emma had come with her after the first few nights, sitting in the chapel pews, listening. She'd brought her phone and recorded some of it. She'd cried the first time Catherine made it through an entire simple piece without stopping a Bach prelude that Catherine had learned when she was 9. "You're doing it," Grandma Emma had whispered. "You're actually doing it." Slowly, painfully, the skill returned. Not all of it, that virtuoso-level technique, was probably gone forever, limited by both the old injury and 50 years of disuse. But enough came back. The basic technique, the understanding of music, the ability to express emotion through the keys that was still there, buried under half a century, but not dead. Catherine had to choose what to play for the fundraiser. She'd thought about it carefully. The old Catherine would have chosen something spectacular, technically brilliant, something to show off. But this Catherine wasn't trying to show off. She was trying to tell a story. She was trying to say goodbye to 50 years of silence and hello to whatever came next. She'd chosen 2 pieces. The first was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat, Major Opus 9, number 2. It had been Annie's favorite. Annie had asked Catherine to play it at her 13th birthday party, which would have been in February 1967. The party that never happened. The Nocturne was beautiful, emotional, not technically overwhelming. Catherine could play it. She could make it beautiful. And it would be for Annie. The second piece, well, that was more ambitious. That was the piece Catherine wasn't sure she could pull off. But if she could, if her hands remembered enough, if the music was still in her somewhere, she wanted to try. She wanted to play Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. The piece she'd performed at Carnegie Hall in 1965. The piece that had made her famous. The piece she'd been known for. It was incredibly difficult. It required power, speed, precision, emotional depth. The old Catherine could have played it in her sleep. This Catherine, 71 years old, with a damaged right hand, and 50 years away from performing, probably couldn't do it justice. But she was going to try. Emma had been doubtful when Catherine told her. "Grandma, that piece is really hard." "Are you sure?" "No," Catherine had admitted. "I'm not sure. But if I'm going to do this, if I'm going to break 50 years of silence, I want to do it completely. I want to play the piece that defined who I used to be, even if I fail, even if I can't pull it off. I need to try." So she'd practiced both pieces. The Nocturne came relatively easily. She'd played it so many times in her youth that it was embedded in her bones. The Rachmaninoff was harder, much harder. Her right hand couldn't quite handle some of the faster passages. She had to slow down certain sections. It wouldn't be perfect. It wouldn't be the performance she'd given at 15, but it would be honest. It would be real. And maybe that was more important than perfect. On the night before the fundraiser, Catherine had stayed at the chapel piano until 2 in the morning. She'd played both pieces through 3 times each. The Nocturne was solid. The Rachmaninoff was rough in places, but she could get through it. Emma had been there watching. When Catherine finished the last run-through, Emma had walked up to the piano and hugged her grandmother. No matter what happens tomorrow, Emma had said, "I'm so proud of you." Annie would be too. Catherine had hugged her back, allowing herself to believe it might be true. And so we return to where we began. November 20th, 2017. The St. Mary's Hospital Charity Fundraiser. Catherine Morrison, 71 years old, sitting at an old upright piano in front of 200 people who had no idea who she was or what was about to happen. The hospital administrator had just finished introducing her. Catherine Morrison, who retired last year after 50 years of dedicated service to our nursing staff, has graciously agreed to play for us this evening." Polite applause, people settling into their seats, checking phones, chatting with neighbors. Just another amateur performance at a charity event. Nothing special expected. Catherine sat at the piano, her hands hovering over the keys. The muscle memory of 50 years ago wanted her to adjust the bench, but it was bolted to the floor. She couldn't adjust it. She'd have to play it as it was. She looked out at the audience. In the front row, Emma sat with tears already streaming down her face, her phone raised to record. Next to Emma was Rachel, Catherine's daughter, who'd been told the story just 2 days ago, and was still processing the revelation that her mother had been someone completely different before Rachel was born. Behind them, scattered through the audience, were faces Catherine recognized. Doctors and nurses she'd worked with for decades. Former patients she'd cared for, now healthy, grown alive because of her dedication. They'd come to support her, expecting a pleasant amateur performance from their beloved former colleague. They had no idea. Catherine closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about Annie, about that 12-year-old girl who'd loved her so much, who'd died too young, who'd spent her last moments on Earth telling her sister to keep playing. "This is for you, Annie," Catherine whispered, too quiet for anyone to hear. She opened her eyes. She put her hands on the keys, and she began to play. The opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat, major, floated into the auditorium. Soft, gentle, achingly beautiful. The chattering in the audience didn't stop immediately. People weren't paying that much attention yet. But within 30 seconds, the talking began to fade. Because even the most musically untrained ear could hear that something was different. This wasn't an amateur plunking out a simple tune. This was someone who understood music at a level most people never reached. By the 1-minute mark, the auditorium was completely silent, except for the piano. People had put their phones away. The doctors and nurses who'd worked with Catherine for decades were sitting up straighter, leaning forward, confused. This was Catherine Morrison, the quiet nurse. Playing like this, Catherine kept her eyes closed as she played, lost in the music. Her right hand ached, but she pushed through it. This piece was about emotion, not technical brilliance. It was about expressing 50 years of grief and guilt and love and loss. It was about a little girl who'd loved this piece, who'd never gotten to hear it as many times as she should have. The Nocturne was a relatively short piece, about 4.5 minutes. Catherine played every note as if it mattered, because it did. Each note was a prayer, an apology, a love letter to her dead sister. The final notes faded into silence. Catherine kept her hands on the keys for a moment, her head bowed, tears streaming down her face. The audience was completely still. No one knew what to do. This had not been what they expected. The emotion had been palpable, the skill obvious even to non-musicians. Who was this woman? Catherine lifted her head. She wiped her eyes quickly with the back of her hand. She looked at Emma, who was crying openly now, still recording. Emma nodded at her. "You can do it," she mouthed. Catherine took a deep breath. She'd planned to stop after the Nocturne. She'd planned to stand up, accept polite applause, sit down. That would have been enough. That would have fulfilled her promise to Emma and broken her 50 years of silence. But sitting there at the piano, with Annie's favorite piece still resonating in the air, Catherine made a decision. She was going to play the Rachmaninoff. She was going to try for the piece that had defined her, the piece she'd performed at Carnegie Hall 52 years ago. Even if she failed, even if she couldn't do it justice, she had to try. She adjusted her position slightly on the bench. She spread her fingers, feeling the old injury in her right hand, protesting. She looked at the keys, seeing in her mind the 15-year-old girl she'd been, the prodigy who'd had everything ahead of her. That girl was gone. But maybe Catherine could find her one more time. She brought her hands down on the keys with power and authority, and the opening chords of Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor crashed into the auditorium like a wave. The transformation was instantaneous and shocking. The gentle emotional nocturne had been beautiful. This was something else entirely. This was power, drama, technical brilliance that should not have been possible from a 71-year-old woman who hadn't performed in 50 years. The opening chords of the Rachmaninoff Prelude are among the most recognizable in classical piano dark dramatic building immediately to overwhelming intensity. Catherine played them with a force that made people jump in their seats. The audience was now completely, utterly transfixed. Phones were coming back out, but this time to record, to capture what was clearly an extraordinary moment. People were leaning forward, mouths open. The hospital staff who'd known Catherine for decades were in shock. This was impossible. This was not the quiet, reserved nurse they'd known. Catherine played with her eyes open now, staring at the keys, her fingers flying across them in passages that should have been beyond her damaged hand. Some of the fastest sections were slower than they should have been. She couldn't quite match the speed she'd had at 15. Some notes were imperfect. There were small mistakes, tiny hesitations. But none of that mattered. Because what Catherine lacked in technical perfection, she made up for in raw emotion and lived experience. The 15-year-old who'd played this piece at Carnegie Hall had been technically flawless, but she'd been a child. She'd understood the notes, but not what they meant. The 71-year-old playing now understood. She'd lived an entire lifetime. She'd experienced love and loss, guilt and grief, sacrifice and dedication. She'd held dying patients and saved lives and buried her husband and carried unbearable secrets. Every single one of those experiences poured into the music. The Rachmaninoff Prelude is about 5 minutes long. Catherine played every second of those 5 minutes as if her life depended on it. The piece builds and builds, intensifying, until it becomes almost overwhelming, and then it releases into a quieter middle section before building again to a thunderous conclusion. By the 2-minute mark, Emma's live stream on social media was being shared rapidly. People were texting friends, "You have to see this. Is this really happening?" Within minutes, the video was spreading across Boston, then across the country. By the 3-minute mark, people in the audience were crying. Not just Emma and Rachel, but doctors and nurses and former patients and random attendees who'd come for a boring charity event and instead were witnessing something transcendent. By the 4-minute mark, someone in the audience, an older doctor, who'd been in medicine long enough to remember the 1960s, suddenly connected the dots. He pulled out his phone, did a quick search, found an old article and gasped out loud. "Oh my God, that's Catherine Aldridge." The whisper spread through the room like wildfire. Catherine Aldridge, the prodigy from the 60s. She disappeared. That's her. After 50 years. Catherine didn't hear any of it. She was lost in the music playing the final section now, the piece building to its massive crashing conclusion. Her right hand was screaming in pain, but she ignored it. This was the last time she would play this piece. This was her goodbye to who she'd been, and her hello to whatever came next. The final chords approached. Catherine played them with everything she had left, both hands coming down on the keys with force, the sound filling the auditorium, enormous and overwhelming and final. The last chord rang out, sustained, slowly fading into silence. Catherine kept her hands on the keys, her head bowed, her entire body shaking. Tears were streaming down her face. Her right hand felt like it was on fire. She didn't care. She'd done it. After 50 years, she'd played again. She'd kept Annie's last wish. She'd come home to herself. The silence in the auditorium lasted for perhaps 5 seconds, though it felt eternal. 200 people completely stunned, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. And then someone started clapping. Just one person at first, but then another and another, and within seconds the entire room was on its feet, applause building like thunder, people shouting and crying and clapping until the sound was deafening. Catherine lifted her head, blinking in confusion. She hadn't expected this. She'd thought maybe polite applause, some confusion questions later. She hadn't expected a standing ovation. She hadn't expected people to be crying. She hadn't expected the sound of 200 people celebrating something they didn't fully understand yet, but knew they'd witnessed something extraordinary. The hospital administrator rushed to the stage, clearly confused about what had just happened. The applause continued thunderous as Catherine slowly stood up from the piano bench, her legs shaking. Emma jumped up from her seat and ran to the stage, climbing up and throwing her arms around her grandmother. Rachel followed, and the three women stood together while the audience continued to applaud. The administrator approached them with a microphone, clearly wanting to say something, but not sure what. Emma gently took the microphone from his hand. I think Emma said, her voice shaking, but carrying across the auditorium, that everyone deserves to know who they just heard play. The applause began to quiet as people realized an explanation was coming. Emma pulled up something on her phone, then gestured to the hospital's tech staff to connect it to the auditorium's projection system. A moment later, an image appeared on the large screen behind the stage. It was a newspaper article from November 1965. The headline read, Catherine Aldridge 15 stuns Carnegie Hall audience. The next great American pianist. The photograph showed a young girl at a piano, her face radiant with concentration and joy. Gasps rippled through the audience. People were looking from the photograph to Catherine and back again. This is my grandmother, Emma said, her arm around Catherine. Catherine Aldridge, who became Catherine Morrison when she married. 52 years ago, she was considered the greatest young musical talent in America. She performed at Carnegie Hall, at the White House, at concert halls around the country. She was offered a full scholarship to Juilliard. Her future was limitless. Emma's voice caught. She took a moment to compose herself. In December 1966, there was a car accident. My grandmother's younger sister Annie was killed. My grandmother was driving. She blamed herself, and she made a decision that night. She would never play piano again. She would give up music entirely. Instead, she would dedicate her life to saving others, to making up for the sister she couldn't save. The audience was completely silent now, everyone transfixed. For 50 years, Emma continued. My grandmother worked at this hospital. She saved countless lives. She comforted dying patients. She was there for all of you in your darkest moments. And none of you knew, none of us knew that she was carrying this grief, this guilt, this enormous sacrifice. Catherine was crying now, not trying to hide it. Rachel had her arms around her mother, crying too. What you just heard Emma said was the first time my grandmother has played piano in 50 years. The piece she finished with the Rachmaninoff prelude was the piece she performed at Carnegie Hall when she was 15. And even after half a century, even with an injury to her hand, even carrying all that grief, you heard what she could do. A doctor in the front row stood up. It was Dr. Marcus Wheeler, who'd worked with Catherine for 30 years. His face was wet with tears. Catherine, he said, his voice choked with emotion. You saved my daughter's life 23 years ago when she was 6. She had meningitis. You were her nurse. You sat with her through the night when we thought we'd lose her. You sang to her. You kept her calm. You were the reason she survived. He gestured to a young woman sitting next to him, his daughter now 29 and healthy. She was crying too. I had no idea, Dr. Wheeler continued. All these years I've been grateful to you for saving my daughter. But I never knew, none of us knew, what you'd given up. what you'd sacrificed. Other people were standing now, calling out their own stories. Patients Catherine had cared for, families she'd supported. A woman shouted that Catherine had been with her when her son was born prematurely, had kept him alive through the night when the doctors weren't sure he'd make it. A man said Catherine had held his father's hand when he died, had sung to him, had made his death peaceful. On and on, story after story, a chorus of people whose lives had been touched by Catherine's dedication. Catherine stood on the stage, overwhelmed, unable to speak. This was what she'd built in 50 years. These were the lives she'd saved, the comfort she'd given, the difference she'd made. This was her alternative life, the one she'd chosen instead of Carnegie Hall and concert tours and fame. And standing there listening to these people, Catherine realized something. She hadn't wasted 50 years. She'd spent them differently than she'd planned, but she hadn't wasted them. Annie's death had been a tragedy unspeakable and unfair, but Catherine's response to it, dedicating herself to saving and comforting others, had meant something, had mattered. Maybe she'd been wrong about the promise. Maybe she'd misunderstood what Annie wanted. But the life she'd lived, the choices she'd made, they had value. Real, tangible value. Emma handed the microphone to Catherine. The room fell silent, waiting. Catherine looked out at the sea of faces. Her voice when she spoke was quiet but steady. I thought she said that I had to stop playing to honor my sister. I thought music had killed her, and so I had to kill the music. I was wrong. She took a breath, gathering her thoughts. Annie loved music. She loved hearing me play. And her last words, the last thing she said before she died, were, keep playing for both of us. I spent 50 years thinking she didn't understand what she was saying, that she was just scared and saying whatever came to mind. But I think I'm finally starting to believe that she understood perfectly. She wanted me to keep going. She wanted me to live for both of us. Catherine's voice broke. She wiped her eyes. I can't get those 50 years back. I can't undo the choices I made. But I can tell you this, I don't regret the life I lived. I don't regret the people I helped, the lives I touched. You, all of you, you made those 50 years meaningful. You gave me purpose when I thought I'd lost mine. She looked directly at Emma, then at Rachel. My granddaughter found my past and dragged me back to it whether I wanted to come or not. She made me confront what I'd given up. And she made me realize that maybe it's not too late. Maybe I can forgive myself. Maybe I can come home to the music without abandoning Annie's memory. She turned back to the audience. So thank you. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for giving me a reason to finally, after 50 years, play again. And thank you for listening to a story I never thought I'd tell. The applause started again, but Catherine held up a hand. One more thing, she said. I started a small fund tonight with the help of my granddaughter. It's called Annie's Legacy. It will provide music therapy programs for patients at this hospital and others. Because music heals. Even when you think it's gone, even when you think you've lost it, it heals. The applause was deafening now. People were on their feet again, crying and clapping, and some were even cheering. Catherine stood there, letting it wash over her, this wave of love and support from people who'd known her for decades, but were only now seeing all of her. Emma's live stream had reached hundreds of thousands of views. By the next morning, it would be in the millions. News outlets would pick up the story. Classical music websites would rediscover Catherine Aldridge. People would debate what she could have been if she hadn't stopped. But more would celebrate what she had been both as a prodigy and as a nurse. But right now, in this moment, none of that future attention mattered. What mattered was Catherine standing on a stage, having just played piano, for the first time in 50 years, surrounded by people who loved her, finally beginning to forgive herself. 6 months later, Emma's video of Catherine's performance had indeed gone viral, reaching over 50 million views. The story had been covered by every major news outlet. Classical music historians had written articles about the lost prodigy who'd emerged after half a century. Recording companies had reached out with offers. Concert halls had invited her to perform. Catherine had declined most of it. She was 71 years old, she explained in the few interviews she gave. She wasn't interested in a comeback tour or recording an album. That wasn't the point. But she had accepted some invitations. She performed at 3 more hospital charity events. She played at a nursing home in Providence, not far from where she'd grown up. She gave a small concert at a children's hospital in Boston, playing for sick kids, who reminded her why she'd spent 50 years in nursing. And she'd established Annie's Legacy, which funded music therapy programs in hospitals across New England. The program brought musicians to play for patients, taught sick children to play instruments, provided music lessons for hospital staff. It was small, but it was growing, and every person it touched was part of Annie's continuing influence on the world. Catherine still lived in Boston. She still visited the hospital frequently, though now as a volunteer coordinator for the music therapy program rather than as a nurse. She spent time with Rachel and Emma. She went to Annie's grave once a month and played recordings of the pieces she was working on, telling her sister about the programs the fund was supporting. And she played piano. Not obsessively, not professionally, but regularly. She'd bought a good upright piano for her house, and she played for an hour most days. Sometimes she worked on challenging pieces, retraining her hands. Sometimes she just improvised, exploring sounds and emotions. Sometimes she played Annie's favorite pieces and cried. The guilt hadn't disappeared completely. Catherine didn't think it ever would. 50 years of guilt didn't evaporate in 6 months, but it had softened. It had become something she could live with, rather than something that consumed her. She was learning slowly to believe that Annie would have wanted her to keep playing, to keep living, to find joy again. On a sunny afternoon in May, 6 months after the hospital performance, Catherine sat at her piano with Emma beside her. Emma had brought her camera, wanting to document her grandmother playing, wanting to preserve these moments. Catherine played Chopin's Nocturne one more time, the piece she'd played for Annie that night at the hospital. When she finished, Emma applauded softly. "How does it feel?" Grandma Emma asked. "To be playing again?" Catherine thought about it for a long moment. "It feels like coming home," she finally said, "like finding a part of myself I thought was dead. It doesn't erase the 50 years or bring Annie back, but it makes me feel more whole than I've felt since I was 16. She looked at the photograph she kept on the piano, now Annie at 12, smiling at the camera, full of life and love and possibility. "I spent so long thinking I had to choose," Catherine said quietly. "Music or Annie, playing or penance. But I'm learning that maybe I can honor her memory and still have music. Maybe I can carry the grief and still find joy. Maybe it's not too late to live a life that includes both." Emma reached over and squeezed her grandmother's hand. "It's never too late," she said. "That's what your story teaches people. It's never too late to forgive yourself. Never too late to come home." Catherine smiled, a real smile, the first one that had reached her eyes in months. "Maybe you're right," she said. She turned back to the piano and began to play again, a simple melody. This time, nothing complex or challenging. Just music for the sake of music, her fingers on the keys, the sound filling her home. And somewhere she liked to imagine Annie was listening and smiling, finally hearing her sister play again, finally seeing Catherine come back to life. The music went on,